So this is going to be Zero Knowledge PCPs from Leakage-Resilient Circuits Revisited, a not yet success story.
It might be your not yet success story. I just want to clarify. Okay, thanks, Alison, for the introduction. It's really great to be here. So yesterday you asked us to say a little bit about how this paper came about. So how did this paper come about? So the project started a long time ago when I was a young PhD student in Israel, which is a country far, far away. And what we were trying to do, so we were trying to take some cryptographic primitive that had some property and add a second property to it. And this wasn't easy, but after like 20 pages of a construction, a proof, I was able to add the second property. I was really happy. I went home for the weekend, came back on Sunday because it's Israel. So the next week, and I reread the proof just to make sure that everything kind of still made sense. And the first line was basically, it's easy to see that property 1 is preserved. It is. So it wasn't so easy for me. And after like 10 minutes, I had an attack. And so this project is basically my efforts on achieving this primitive that you don't yet know what it is, but achieving it with both of the properties together. So I think I really earned my spot in CFAIL by not just ending with a failure, but also starting with a failure. So where does our story begin? It begins here. It's a pretty tranquil view, I think, for failure. So this is the Tel Aviv beach, and in 2016, the first TCC of that year took place in Tel Aviv, and there was a paper there about zero-knowledge PCPs from leakage-resilient circuits. So this is by Yuval Ishai and Guang Yang and myself. And the thing is, there's an asterisk here on the zero-knowledge, and this is because we don't get efficient simulation. We get inefficient simulation or efficient simulation in a different model. So you might not know what PCPs are or even what zero knowledge is, but hopefully you know about the simulation paradigm, and you know that in general we want efficient simulation. So the original goal of this work was to construct this primitive, zero knowledge PCPs with efficient simulation. The failure of this work is to construct zero knowledge PCPs with efficient simulation. But luckily, I feel like I personally have gained some intuition along the way as to how you might or might not construct zero-knowledge PCPs from leakage-resilient circuits. So luckily, my talk won't end here. And basically, what we were able to do is, first is to come up with candidate leakage-resilient circuits that either have better leakage resilience guarantees or better soundness guarantees. Or look at known constructions and point to barriers towards extending their leakage resilience guarantees, and also kind of make progress towards taking this framework of IWI of constructing zero knowledge from leakage resilience and try to extend it to other proof systems. So we're gonna have 3 parts of the talk. The first part is going to be background about probabilistically checkable proofs and zero knowledge probabilistically checkable proofs. The second part is going to be about this framework of how to construct zero-knowledge PCPs from leakage-resilient circuits. And even if you don't care anything about zero knowledge and proof systems and anything, you can think of this part as basically kind of specifying what properties do we want from the leakage-resilient circuits. So the end goal might be to construct zero-knowledge PCPs, but it's just useful properties to have from leakage-resilient circuits. And then in the third part, I'm going to kind of present these partial results for leakage-resilient circuits. Okay, so let's begin. So what are probabilistically checkable proofs? It's a really cool proof system where basically you can verify a proof without reading it. So anyone who ever graded student assignments would have really loved to use probabilistically checkable proofs. So how does it work? So we have this verifier that, so for the purpose of this talk, let's think of the statement that we want to verify as being that some circuit is satisfiable. So we're talking about circuit satisfiability. The verifier knows the circuit C, wants to check that it's satisfiable. The verifier has oracle access to a purported proof, and it's going to read few bits from the proof and either be convinced or not be convinced. Now, because we're talking about crypto and cryptographic applications, we want to think of this proof as not just, appearing out of the blue, but efficiently generated by some proofer given the NP witness. So what we want is completeness. So first of all, if the circuit is satisfiable, the verifier is always convinced by this honestly generated proof. And we want soundness, meaning that if the circuit is not satisfiable, then any proof string you can come up with, even if you have unbounded computational resources, with high probability won't convince the verifier. So we're talking about unconditional security here. Okay, so these are probabilistically checkable proofs. Now, when we talk about zero-knowledge PCPs, what do we mean? So this is defined in the standard ideal real paradigm. So we're going to compare the real-world execution with an ideal world execution. Now, we already know what the real world looks like. We have a verifier, perhaps a malicious verifier, that has oracle access to a proof that was generated from the NP witness. And we want to say, basically, the verifier doesn't learn anything about the witness. So what we want to say is that you can efficiently simulate the view of this verifier with a simulator that has no access to the NP witness. So the simulator can't know anything about the witness. So this would be great. But unfortunately, you can't satisfy this property because the verifier is any malicious polynomial time verifier. The proof has polynomial length. The verifier can read the entire proof. And the proof somehow encodes the witness. It encodes information about the witness. So how are we going to get around it? So we're going to limit this resource of access to the proof. So we're going to restrict the verifier, but only in terms of the number of queries that the verifier can make to the proof. So other than that, the verifier can run in unbounded time, use unbounded resources. And we're going to require that as long as the verifier makes at most this Q star number of queries to the proof, so Q star is an a priori bound that we set on the proof system, then we can efficiently simulate the view. And moreover, the real and simulated views are going to be statistically close. So in general, you set this parameter Q star, your proof is going to be polynomial in Q star, and hopefully your honest verifier is only going to make a sublinear number of queries in Q star. So for example, polylog of Q star. So what do we know about zero-knowledge PCPs? So forget zero-knowledge for a moment. What do we know about PCPs? So we have great PCPs by now. So we know that you can come up with a PCP where the overhead compared to the NP witness is only polylogarithmic. You can verify them with polylog many queries, and you can do this non-adaptively. So one round of query and response. When you add zero knowledge to this, that's not so nice. So first thing, the proof blows up to polynomial length. And the second thing is that now even the honest verifier has to be adaptive. So even the honest verifier has to make several rounds of queries to the proof. And this raises a natural question, which is what's the cost of adding zero knowledge to PCPs? So specifically, do we have to blow up the proof by a polynomial factor? Do we have to settle for adaptive verification, or can we get non-adaptive verification? I think it's a natural question to ask. But also, personally, for me, I have the motivation that I don't like to pay for things I can get for free. So I don't want to pay for the cost of zero knowledge. Okay, so this question was actually the main research question for two papers in TCC. So in TCC 2016. The first is by Ben Sasson et al. And they construct zero knowledge PCPs with quasi-linear length proof and a non-adaptive verifier. That's great. The way in which they get that is by basically pushing adaptivity to the prover. So what does this mean? It means the prover generates a proof, sends it to the verifier. The verifier sends a message to the prover generates a second oracle, sends this to the verifier, then the verifier queries the proof. So this is not really a PCP because the prover is now adaptive and generates several oracles. And this was generalized a bit later to something called interactive oracle proofs, which have seen applications for blockchains, for example. So this is a useful tool, but it's not a PCP. The second work from TCC was this work with Yuval and Guang that I started telling you about. And what we get is zero-knowledge PCPs with non-adaptive honest verifier, but with polynomial length proofs, and the simulation is inefficient. So if we want to get PCPs, so for example, with non-adaptive verification, which is going to be the focus of this work, and with efficient simulation, I guess the natural starting point would be this work, because it's basically the only PCP that we know that has non-adaptive verification with some sort of zero-knowledge guarantees. Okay. So that brings us to the second part of how do we get these zero-knowledge PCPs from leakage-resilient circuits. So what was the main insight of this work with Yuval and Guang? So we were looking at these PCP systems where you have a verifier that queries bits of a proof that was generated from the NP witness. And we asked ourselves, a malicious verifier. What do we know about what the malicious verifier learns? So basically the only thing we know about a malicious verifier is it only reads few bits of the proof. Few physical bits of the proof, that's all the verifier learns. These proof bits encode the witness in some sense. So these are few information bits on the witness. And the main point here is that it doesn't matter how the verifier behaves, we know a lot about the type of information that is leaked because that depends only on the honest prover. The honest prover is the one that takes the witness and encodes it into the proof. So, for example, so the type of information depends on the prover algorithm, and we want to think of the prover algorithm not as a function of just the satisfying input for the circuit, but as a function of the entire wire values of the circuit. So what does a malicious verifier learn? A malicious verifier learns some function from a specific type of function. We know what it is. It's the prover algorithm applied to the entire wire values of some circuit. That's called leakage. Leakage on the wires of the circuit. And as I said, we know what type of information, right? For example, if the prover is computationally simple. So for example, if the prover computes constant depth Boolean circuits of unbounded fan-in and fan-out, like AC0 circuits, then the leakage that the verifier learns is leakage from AC0 circuits. So this means, for example, if the circuit C resists this type of leakage, then we get zero knowledge. The verifier doesn't learn anything. But in general, I mean, there's no reason for this circuit to be leakage resilient. Luckily, there's a way of making the circuit leakage resilient, even if you started out with a circuit that wasn't leakage resilient. And this way is called a transformation that is called leakage resilient circuit compilers. So what are these? What's this primitive? So it's a circuit compiler. It takes an original circuit C and transforms it into a compiled circuit C hat that emulates the original circuit, but operates over encoded inputs. So we have, instead of the original secret input W for the circuit, we have now an encoding of it, a random encoding of it. Now, what does it mean that the circuit resists leakage from some leakage class L? It means you have an efficient simulator that is given the description of the circuit and its output on the secret input W. The simulator can generate the entire wire values of the compiled circuit, the leakage resilient circuit. So it can simulate the entire wire values. And no leakage function can tell the difference between the simulated and the real when the real is evaluated on a random encoding. Okay, so again, you have a simulator. The simulator only knows the description of the circuit and the output and can generate the entire wire values, and this fools all leakage functions in the class. Okay, so with this tool of leakage resilient circuits, how do we, I should tell you a little bit about what we know about leakage resilient circuits, sorry. Okay, so what do we know about leakage resilient circuits? So one thing we know is you can't protect against any leakage that you want because of the impossibility of obfuscation. So what do leakage resilient works do? They somehow restrict the leakage class. How? Either by talking about computationally bounded leakage, so for example, AC0 circuits or probing attacks and so on. Or they restrict it to be kind of local, operate on different parts of the computation separately. And I'm not going to say more about this paradigm of only computation leaks, just because I'm going to say more about it later on. Okay, so one thing that's common to most of these constructions is that they use masks to hide the internal computation. So what are these masks? It's some form of structured randomness. Usually it's called something like opaque gates or leak-free components or something like that, but you can also think of it as part of the input encoding. So what does that mean? If before I was kind of vague and I said, okay, instead of the input you have this W hat, so now I'm going to think of it as a component that encodes the input W and these masks. And this is structured randomness that the circuit takes as input, and it should have this structure, otherwise you don't preserve the functionality of the circuit. Okay, so now we can take these leakage-resilient circuits and see how to get zero-knowledge PCPs from them. So going back to this picture of what a PCP is, so the idea is, we would want the circuit to resist leakage, but we can't be sure that it really does resist leakage. So instead, we're going to replace this circuit with a leakage-resilient version of it. Resilient against what? So resilient exactly against what the verifier, the malicious verifier, learns. So what is that? The verifier basically learns a function which is obtained by applying the prover function and then restricting the output to few bits. Every restriction gives you a new function, a different function. So we get like a list of functions depending on the specific restriction we have in mind. So we're interested in leakage resilience against this class L, and we replace the original circuit with this leakage resilient circuit. And now we get zero knowledge because the verifier only learns leakage on the wires of a circuit that resists exactly this type of leakage. So this is zero knowledge. And also verification is non-adaptive, because what did we do to the verifier algorithm? Nothing. It's the same verification procedure. We just changed the statement that we were proving. So this is great. But a PCP system should also have a soundness guarantee. And it turns out that if you have a malicious prover, the prover can actually cheat. So why is that? It's because, as I said, the computations in this leakage-resilient circuit are masked. The masks are provided as part of the input encoding, right? And the masks are structured randomness. And if they don't have the right structure, you might be able to change the functionality of the circuit. Scratch that, you actually will be able to change the functionality of the circuit. This is actually exactly the way in which you get leakage resilience. This is exactly what the leakage resilience simulator does. The leakage resilience simulator doesn't know what the input is, and it uses invalid masks, like ones without the right structure, to exactly force the output to be whatever it wants it to be. So this means that a malicious prover can cheat, can actually satisfy the circuit. So what do we need? We need leakage-resilient circuits with an additional soundness guarantee. So in the original paper with Yuval and Ishai, with Yuval and Kwong, we call this SAT respecting. This would have taken 2 hours of a talk to say SAT respecting every time. So instead, I'm going to call it soundness for the purpose of this talk. What does soundness mean? It means that if you can satisfy the compiled circuit, then that means the original circuit was also satisfiable. Now, if you have this guarantee, you know a malicious prover can't cheat because he can't satisfy this, this compiled circuit. Doesn't matter which input it provides, even if it tries to give invalid masks. Yeah.
Is this why your oracle size is closer?
Is this what? Why?
Your oracle size is closer?
So I'm going to answer that, I think, on the next slide. Okay? But if I forget, then remind me. Okay, so going back to the beginning of the talk, basically very inaccurately, but roughly, I started out with a sound primitive, and I was trying to add zero knowledge, and I succeeded quite spectacularly, but also I kind of ruined the soundness. So if you want to get something that's not sound and is zero knowledge, there's a pretty easy way to get it. So I was just basically, 20 pages of proof that didn't go anywhere. So this is kind of where we go back to the prologue. Okay, so let's kind of summarize this framework and see where we hit a wall with the inefficient simulation. So basically, IWY, we show that you can construct zero-knowledge PCPs if you start out with leakage-resilient circuits that are sound and are resilient against the prover algorithm of some PCP. And we construct sound leakage-resilient circuits that have inefficient simulation. They're based on the leakage-resilient circuits of Faust, Rabin, Raisin, Tromer, and Vekutanapa. Yeah. And they resist the prover algorithm from a specific PCP system, basically the Aurora-Safra PCP, one of the first PCPs. So why do we have this polynomial blow-up? So one reason is using this PCP. This has polynomial blow-up. It's not one of the best PCPs. The reason we use it is because the prover algorithm is simple, computationally simple. The second reason is this construction of leakage-resilient circuits. It also blows up the circuit by at least a quadratic factor. And the third reason is our construction also blows up the proof length. Okay, so three reasons.
Constant bit verification.
What?
The PCP.
What about it?
It's constant bit verification.
It's polylog because you want to get negligible error. Yes. So Aurora and Safra don't get constant. Well, they do get constant, but we want to get negligible error. Okay, so in these LRCCs have inefficient simulation. This is exactly why we get inefficient zero-knowledge simulation. So if we want to get efficient zero-knowledge simulation, we'd better get leakage-resilient circuits with efficient simulation. So why do we get inefficient simulation in the leakage-resilient circuits? So one reason is just our construction. Okay, it inherently causes inefficient simulation. It kind of forces the simulator to find a satisfying witness. Okay, but maybe we could come up with a better construction. So maybe we were just not smart enough to come up with the right construction. So another thing that is proven in this work is that actually, you might be able to improve the technical details, but if you start off with this Faust leakage-resilient circuits, you're not going to get efficient simulation. And the reason is that these leakage-resilient circuits, they satisfy a really strong property of leakage resilience, which inherently causes inefficient zero-knowledge in the PCP system unless NP is contained in BPP. And this is not, just because the Faust leakage-resilient circuits are, extraordinary. Most leakage-resilient circuits actually satisfy this strong leakage resilience property.
If I just want to prove statements about P, say this circuit evaluates to Y on X, then would it still be strong?
So why does this hold? So it needs, for the impossibility or to imply that NP is contained in BPP, you need two things. One is you need a sound leakage resilient circuit, and the other is you need leakage resilience against useful leakage. So what is useful leakage? I'll touch on it later, but basically if it contains a PCP prover for NP, then this impossibility holds. So it depends whether you start off with a PCP that can only capture P, then you might be able to, circumvent this impossibility. Yeah. Okay, so basically this framework gives us a blueprint of the leakage resilient circuits of our dreams. So they should satisfy three properties. So the first is they should be sound. You know what soundness means. It means compiled circuit is satisfiable, then original circuit is satisfiable. They should have a weak property of leakage resilience, not a strong one, so that we don't hit this wall here. And they should resist leakage from a useful class of leakage functions. So we need to explain these two things, the weak and the useful. So weak, I'm going to explain in this slide, and useful in the next one. So what does weak leakage resilience mean, or what is a plausible definition of weak leakage resilience that we could use? So before we define a weak, let's go back to what was the strong leakage resilience property. So it basically said there is a simulator. The simulator gets the circuit, description of the circuit, the output on the secret input, can generate the entire wire values. This fools all leakage functions. If you think about this for a moment, this definition is super strong. So why is it? Usually when we think of simulation, even the strongest form, so you have black box access to the adversary, you still interact with the adversary. You get to somehow learn something about how the adversary acts. Here, the simulator is not given any access to the adversary, which is the leakage function in this case. So basically, we tell the simulator, look, this is the circuit, this is the output, simulate the adversary's view, and it better look like the adversary's view, but I'm not going to tell you anything about how the adversary behaves. So this is very strong, and it's kind of not in line with what we usually want in crypto. So what would be a more standard definition? So here's an example, and it could be defined differently. But for example, one thing you could do is you could give the simulator also a description of the leakage function. This corresponds to non-black box access in some sense. And you could tell the simulator, okay, now I want you to simulate the output of the leakage function, of this specific leakage function, and I want it to look indistinguishable from the actual leakage. Another option is, so you can think of something that's similar to black box access. You give the simulator one-time access to the leakage function. So the simulator can do whatever it wants, and then it has one-time access to the leakage function, and based on this, has to simulate the output of the leakage function. So there are several ways in which you can define them, and for the purpose of this talk, it's not that important. Just you have to kind of switch where the leakage comes into play. So this is what weak leakage resilience means. So what does useful leakage resilience mean? So remember that for us, leakage is the PCP prover where its output is restricted to few bits. So useful basically means whatever class contains a PCP prover, so that we can resist leakage from this PCP prover. So what do we know about these classes of functions? So for example, in leakage resilience, people talk about probing security. This doesn't contain a PCP prover. Probing in the context of PCPs basically means you just take bits of the witness and copy them into the proof. But for the local verifiability property, you have to be able to, you have to somehow error correct encode the witness. Another function class that people talk about are AC0 circuits. So constant depth Boolean circuits of unbounded fan-in and fan-out. This also doesn't contain a PCP prover because most PCPs have some kind of a sum-check component where you compute sums of wires of the circuit, which you can't do if you don't have XOR gates. So another class, which is very powerful, is this only computation leaks or OCL plus paradigm. So what do we have here? So we look at the compiled circuit and we kind of divide it into different parts or sections. So for example, 2 parts, a left part and a right part. And leakage functions can operate on each section separately. They can perform arbitrary efficient computations, but their output length is restricted. And you can leak from left, right, left, left, right, left, and so on. So this is very powerful leakage. So for example, you can compute the sum of all wires of the circuit. But it turns out that for zero-knowledge PCPs, this is totally unhelpful. And the reason is that, again, for this local verifiability, the encoding of the witness has to have a lot of cross-references. You can't operate on one part of the witness and another part of the witness and then a little bit of correlation between them. So this is a recent result from 2017 proving that, proving in a completely different context, but basically you can interpret the result as saying that only computation leaks doesn't contain a PCP prover. So actually, the only thing I know is that AC0 with a few XOR gates does contain a PCP prover, and this is because IW1 proved that it contains the Aurora Safra PCP prover. So I'm going to focus on this class, not because, any other reason except this is the only class I know that is computationally weak and contains a PCP prover.
So all these classes that do not contain a PCP prover, they probably cannot contain a PCP prover?
No, we just, so probing provably and OCL provably doesn't contain. AC0, I don't see how it will contain. It doesn't contain any of the constructions that we know of, but
there are bounds on error correcting codes in AC0. Maybe you could at least restrict forms of PCPs too.
Maybe. Okay, so this brings us to the third part of these kind of preliminary or partial results. So these two are kind of divided into 3 parts. So the first part is to try and extend the leakage resilience guarantees of sound leakage resilient circuits. So what's the motivation? The motivation is for zero-knowledge PCPs, we need both, kind of a leakage resilience against useful leakage and soundness. So if you start with something that's sound, basically the only thing you need to do is extend leakage resilience. So we have 2 types of results here. So the first is we look at the first leakage resilient circuits of Ishai, Sahar, and Wagner. They are probing secure. And we give a candidate construction based on this that we conjecture does resist this useful leakage from AC0 with a few XOR gates. And then we look at a much more recent construction by Goyal et al. And we show that there are inherent limitations to extending its leakage resilience to resist this type of leakage. Then the second type of results we have is that of adding soundness to leakage resilient circuits. So here the motivation is that, again, we need soundness and leakage resilience against useful leakage. If you start with something that resists useful leakage, or we might be able to easily extend it to resist useful leakage or something like that, the only thing you need is to add soundness. So you have two types of results here. The first is that we take the leakage resilient circuits of ADF and we construct a sound variant of this leakage resilient circuit. This is still only a partial result, because these leakage resilient circuits are only probing secure. So we need to extend this to a useful leakage class as well. And the second thing is that we make a first step towards constructing a sound variant of the leakage resilient circuits of Miles and Viola. These do resist useful leakage. And then the third type of result is about extending this framework from PCPs to other proof systems. Why? Because we hope to get other proof systems that are zero knowledge and have non-adaptive verification. Different types of proof systems have different cryptographic applications, so this might improve these other cryptographic applications for which PCPs are insufficient. And specifically, what we do is we focus on PCPs of proximity, which could be thought of as a generalization of PCPs. And I want to say a little bit more about this, just because I won't say, like, after this slide, I'm not going to say anything about this last result. So basically, we construct the transformation, but we have a missing piece there, and that's the encoding of the input. We need to encode the input with a code that I currently don't know how to construct, or I don't even know if it exists. So what is this code? We're looking for a linear code that has good distance, so like constant relative distance or something like that, that resists leakage from AC0 with XOR gates. So that means that if you take any two messages and you randomly encode them, then leakage functions can't tell the difference. Can't tell whether, so they can tell whether you have a valid code word, but they can't tell whether it's encoding this message or this message. And this is the piece that we're missing in this construction. Okay, so if you know anything about leakage resilient circuits, you probably know there are a lot of them, and I am only using 4. So why? So I'm using 4 because when you start to look for leakage resilient circuits that might help you construct zero knowledge PCPs, there aren't that many. So I kind of want to map out the leakage resilient. Yeah.
Just at a higher level, that first line seems like a success, right? Not a failure. All the others are like almost lying.
Which first line? The extending leakage
Construct the candidate. Well, assuming your assumption is true, your conjecture is true.
But our conjecture is that it's secure. Okay.
But so under this conjecture, everything works.
Yes.
Got it. Okay.
Okay. It's a strong conjecture. I will grant you that. But I will claim that ISW is also, if you try to extend it, also makes a very strong claim.
Yeah, my comment was meant to be positive. Like, why continue after you succeeded in the
because
first
I want
line?
to prove, right?
Okay.
Because I want to prove. Yeah.
Thanks.
I think I would also be like kinda happy if I could reduce it to some other conjecture, which is not just I conjecture that my system is secure. Because if I did this, I could basically stop with my original construction that wasn't sound. That
Here
also.
you don't even make a conjecture, it's sound. So you know that it's not.
No, yeah, I know. But if I didn't prove it then I could stop.
I see.
Yeah. Okay, so there are a lot of leakage resilient circuits, and I kind of want to map the landscape, and I'm gonna kind of spoiler alert, if you're up high on the mountains, that means you're gonna be somewhat helpful for zero knowledge PCPs. So there are different categories. What? I'm just saying, like all these leakage resilient circuits are really helpful for different applications, but we have to narrow it down to the application we have in mind. Okay, so there are different categories we can look at. One is, like, are they sound, are they not sound? So most leakage resilient circuits are not sound. because they use this structured randomness. And their colors didn't come out so well. So they're very far from being sound because the amount of structured randomness they use is proportional to the computation size. So that's a lot. There are a few, like a handful of constructions that are sound. These are basically the two leakage resilient circuits that we were looking at by ISW and GAMSS. They don't use any structured randomness. There's also the construction of ADF, does use structured randomness, but there's hope to get soundness because it only, the amount of structured randomness it uses is only proportional to the input length, not the computation size. Then another criteria is whether you get strong leakage resilience with this universal simulator that doesn't know anything about the leakage function. So this is not going to be particularly helpful because we would get inefficient simulation. Another type another category is whether you get computational leakage resilience. So usually this is information theoretic. The leakage functions really can't tell the difference. There are works on computational leakage resilience, which are going to be less useful because PCPs have unconditional security. And the last thing is whether you resist useful leakage or not. And this too is going to be something that we care about because useful leakage is going to help us with leakage resilient, with constructing zero knowledge PCPs. So if you kind of can't tell the green here, basically you see that the leakage resilient circuits that we looked at are exactly the ones on the mountains. So for the sound ones, the motivation was if you have little or no structured randomness, then you're almost sound, or you are sound. So we just need to care about the leakage resilience. For the useful leakage resilience, looking at the Miles and Viola leakage resilient circuits, the motivation was that they resist a rich class of leakage functions. So this class might contain other PCPs, not just the Aurora Safra PCP. And this has motivation beyond getting efficient simulation. So for example, if you start off with one of the best PCPs there are, you might be able to push the proof length down to quasi-linear, which you can't do if you start with Aurora Safra that blows up, quadratically blows up the proof. Unfortunately, I do want to mention that, if you look at this Miles Viola construction, you also see that it's down here with a strong leakage resilience. So we know that, Miles Viola can help us maybe improve the proof length, but it won't help us get efficient simulation. Okay. So this is kind of to help you if you ever want to maybe make this a success story, kind of stick to the mountains. Okay. So now I want to tell you a little bit about these constructions that we have. So I'm going to start with how to extend leakage resilience guarantees of sound leakage resilient circuits, so ISW and GAMSS. So before I do that, I need to tell you a little bit about how leakage resilient circuits work. Not all of them, the ones that I'm going to present in this talk, and they're pretty simple. The high-level idea is pretty simple. So you take a wire in the original circuit and you replace it with a bundle. What's a bundle? It's a collection of wires that jointly encode the original wire. And then you take a gate and you replace it with a gadget, which is a circuit that operates over encodings, but emulates the operation of the gate on these encodings, on the bundles. And then if you want to compile a circuit, you take the original circuit, you replace each wire with a bundle, each gate with a gadget, you get a new, bigger circuit, more wires, more gates, and it's leakage resilient. Okay, so the first thing we wanted to do was kind of prove that ISW resists useful leakage. So leakage from AC0 with a few XOR gates. So what do ISW do? It's the first leakage resilient circuit. It's an ad hoc construction that's fairly simple. The bundles carry parity encodings and they have gadgets for and not, which is complete for Boolean circuits. And they only prove it's probing resilient. But it's actually conjectured to resist leakage from AC0. And even used in practice sometimes as resisting this type of leakage, but we don't have any candidate simulators.
What do you mean used in practice?
It's used as if it can resist.
Who is using leakage resilient circuits? Like in which context?
No, more practical works.
I just have no idea what this means.
But not actual circuits.
No, not as far as I know. No, I'm not
Practical
good.
one meaning academic paper.
Yes, yes. Yeah.
Okay.
For me, this is used in practice.
In academic practice.
In academic practice, yeah, thanks. So that is why I say it's not so bad to conjecture that this construction resists AC0 with XOR gates, like this variant of ISW, because ISW resists AC0 leakage, is conjectured to resist AC0 leakage, which is also not a reduction to a different assumption, just assuming that the construction does that. It's not conjectured though in their paper. They just prove probing security. Okay, so the first thing to kind of note is that this is insecure against AC0 with XOR gates because XOR gates can decode any wire of the circuit. So you can learn any individual wire, you can learn AC0 functions of the wires. This really is, there's an attack. Like it doesn't resist AC0 leakage. Okay, so what is the hope? The hope is that maybe if we kind of tweak the construction, we can get AC0, leakage resilience against AC0 with XOR gates. And the high-level idea is pretty simple. The idea is just, instead of Z2, use Z3. So instead of parity, use additive encoding over Z3 and emulate the operation of the gates of and not over Z3. So very simple. Now when you come to actually implement this, there are a few problems. So one of them is, what does it even mean? Not over Z3. What's the not of a 2? And the answer is, I don't care. I only care about emulating Boolean circuits, so I can meaningfully define what and not over Z3 mean for Boolean inputs. And once I do that, I can actually, really simple adaptations of the original gadgets of ISW work and really give us the functionality that we want. Another issue is that, well, now our inputs are no longer bits. They're field elements. But they should represent bits. So we need to make sure that they do represent, that whatever you get, field element, does represent a bit. So we need to make this, to somehow check that the inputs do encode bits. And we can do this fairly simply because Z3 is a very small field. So to sum up...
Encoding bits just means it is equal either 0 or 1.
Yes. No, it shouldn't be 2, yes. So the input encoding contains the inputs and the masks that are not structured here. So the mask should be completely random, and that can contain 2. So that I don't care about. And it should, actually, because it should be completely random field elements. But the inputs should be either 0 or 1. Yeah. Okay, so to sum up, we come up with a candidate leakage-resilient circuits against AC0 with XOR gates. It's sound. Sound is like, we prove that it's sound. We also prove that it's probing resilient, just as a sanity check to make sure that I didn't break the original ISW. But I don't know how to prove that it resists AC0 leakage with XOR gates. Yes?
What's the probing bound tolerance? Is it like polylogarithmic?
So it's a parameter. You set the parameter and you blow up by a...
You use like Braverman to prove that if you have like k-wise independence, then maybe, at least for AC0, maybe without parity gates. We can talk about that.
Okay, yeah, I'd like to talk about it, yeah. Okay. So the main open problem here is to prove that this resists AC0 leakage with XOR gates, or even just come up with a candidate simulator. And I think, to do this, basically whatever ideas you use to prove or disprove will translate to the original ISW construction compared to resistance against AC0 leakage. So is this something that's easy? I don't think so. As a community, I think we're far from proving that ISW resists AC0 leakage. As a proof, I'm going to use smarter people that tried to do this before me. How do I know that smarter people tried to do this before me? Follow-up works that did achieve AC0 leakage resilience didn't start off with ISW. They did things that are completely different. And I think that several smart people have looked at this and they don't know how to prove that ISW is secure against AC0. And I guess proving this variant is secure against AC0 with XOR gates would translate back because the construction is so similar. So I don't think it's an easy question, but I think it's an interesting one.
I have a question. First of all, it's a two-part question. When you say that if you can prove AC0 and XOR gates resilience, it would translate to ISW,
I think
is this
so.
a formal statement?
No,
or just
I
maybe-
think so. I think
is it
so.
similar? And second, what if you proved AC0 resilience, according, like what Marshall was saying, I don't know if it's going to work or not, but let's say you managed to prove AC0 resilience without XOR gates. Would that translate to AC0 resilience of ISW? Would that be interesting?
I think it would be very interesting on its own. I don't know if it translates. I didn't think about that, actually, because we don't know, right? Okay, so this was the first leakage-resilient circuit. So then when this failed, I said, okay, so instead of the first, let's fast forward like a decade later and look at other leakage-resilient circuits where we have here Ishai and Sahai, so two of the original three authors of the paper. Maybe, now we can do something with this. So actually, when you look at what GIMSS does, it doesn't look very promising in the zero-knowledge
Only they
PCP.
talk to Wagner.
What? If they talk to Wagner, yeah, maybe. Yeah. Okay, so when we look at what they actually get, seems not very promising for zero-knowledge PCPs. So what do they get? They get a sound leakage-resilient circuit, that's great. Resists OCL plus leakage, not so great. Has inefficient simulation, not so great either. They basically use some probing resilient circuits. Specifically, they rely on ISW, but they do a lot of much fancier stuff, and it's much more general than ISW, which was why I was hoping we can do something with it. So, one thing you should be kind of worried about is it has inefficient simulation. We want to get efficient simulation, so this seems useless. But actually, not all hope is lost. So actually, in a recent work with Daniel Genkin and Yuval Ishai, we were able to use, in a different context, to use this compiler together with some other leakage-resilient circuits to get efficient simulation for leaky trusted parties. So I was hoping that, this inefficient simulation we could make work. What about the OCL+? So this is more of a problem. We know that it's insufficient for zero-knowledge PCPs. It doesn't contain a PCP prover. So what was my hope? My hope was to prove that GIMSS actually doesn't resist just OCL leakage, but also resists useful leakage, leakage from AC0 with XOR gates. And when I was kind of looking at how this works, I realized that if you want to prove this statement, you actually need to prove that the probing resilient circuit you start off with is not probing resilient, resists AC0 with XOR gates. So what does this mean? It means if you want to get leakage resilience of this compiler against useful leakage, ISW has to resist this useful leakage. So no point in looking at this compiler. And I want to explain to you why this is. I don't want you to just trust me. So what do they actually do? So they start off with some original circuit. They transform it into a probing resilient circuit. So you replace each wire with a bundle, each gate with a gadget. You get a new circuit, much more wires, much more gates. And then they replace that with a parity resilient circuit. So this is a circuit that resists basically parities computed on the wires of the circuit. I don't want to get into more details because it doesn't matter for this talk. What is important is that the transformation from probing resilient to parity resilient uses an encoding of a constant size and a gadget of a constant size. So when you look at moving from original to parity resilient, this is a non-constant blow-up because this transformation causes a non-constant blow-up, like roughly the security parameter or the security parameter squared. But if you're looking from probing resilient to parity resilient, everything's constant. And then the last step is they take this parity resilient circuit and they basically emulate the way it operates, but over additive secret shares. So this is what you get. From original to probing to parity with constant, kind of constant overhead, and then emulation over additive secret sharing.
Does the parity resilient require that you start with something probing resilient? Or if I compile, can I get like some sort of parity resilient just compiling any something?
The parity resilience comes from the probing resilience, yes. Because basically what they say is if your function uses too few wires, then you're probing resilient and you're good. And if it uses too many wires, then because the encoding is kind of uncorrelated for parities, and you get a lot of contributions from different wires, then this is, yeah. So this construction, I don't see how it would work with not using a probing resilient. Maybe you have some other way of coming up with something that would work. Okay, so we want to resist leakage from AC0 with a few XOR gates. So the first observation is, XOR gates kill emulation over additive secret sharings, because secret shares, because they can just decode, right, recover the original secret. So this layer on top of the parity resilience doesn't help. The second observation is that AC0 circuits, so constant depth, Boolean circuits, unbounded fan-in and fan-out, they can recover any constant-sized encoding, and they can recover the original inputs and outputs of every constant-sized gate. They can basically compute any constant-sized function. So this, moving from probing resilient to parity resilient, doesn't help us. So we're left with probing resilient, right? So basically not zero knowledge, leakage resilience against AC0 with XOR gates means the probing resilient circuit is actually much stronger than probing resilient. So GIMSS doesn't seem to get us anything. Okay, so this was the part about trying to add leakage resilience or extend leakage resilience guarantees. Now let's talk a little bit, really briefly, about adding soundness to leakage resilient circuits. So we we look at two leakage resilient circuits. The first one is the ADF leakage resilient circuits. They are probing resilient. So it looks like, they're not sound because we make them sound, and they're probing resilient, so why even look at them not as ISW? It's because they have the advantage of generality. So they work over arbitrary fields, so Boolean or arithmetic. When you have an arithmetic circuit, you basically replace addition, subtraction, and multiplication with gadgets. The bundles carry some error-correcting encoding, so this could be Shamil or AG coding. For this talk, I'm going to talk about the Shamil-based construction. And they use structured randomness, but just a little bit. So basically, the only place where they use structured randomness is in the input encoding. The input is a Shamir encoding. So this is an error-correcting code, which means not all strings of the right length do actually encode something. And this is where the structure comes from. So when we want a sound variant of the ADF leakage resilient circuits, basically the only thing we need to do is to verify that the encodings are valid, that they really encode something. They're valid Shamir encodings. And there's like an asterisk here because it's not the only thing, but the other thing is like super technical and super easy, so I don't want to get into it. So if we need to verify that the inputs are valid, we need an input checker, and it has to be leakage resilience so that it doesn't ruin leakage resilience. And we get this sound variant at the ADF leakage resilient circuits, and we do this, well, kind of in the lazy way. We look at the construction, we actually observe that they actually do it for us in some sense. So their multiplication gadget can be used to get an input checker. And why is this lazy? It's because I'm taking a gadget that I know is leakage resilient, and I'm using it. So I would get leakage resilience for free. I don't need to prove anything new, basically. Okay, so to explain this variant, I want to tell you a little bit about how their multiplication gadget works, like really briefly and oversimplified. So if they want to get T probing security, they encode their inputs using degree T Shamil encodings. So basically it means you just write out the valuation of the polynomial at so many points. So the number of points is 2t plus 1. We'll see why 2t plus 1 in a moment. A valid encoding is a polynomial, where the evaluations are consistent with a degree T polynomial. Now, how does multiplication work? Very inaccurately, like this is not, what I describe here is not leakage resilient, it doesn't work, but like it's sufficient for the purpose of this talk. You want to multiply A and B, you get as input two polynomial representations, degree T, at 2t plus 1 points. You pointwise multiply, you get a degree 2t polynomial. You can reconstruct because you have 2t plus 1 points. You decode it, you compute the coefficients. That's basically what you do. As I said, it's not leakage resilient and it's not correct, but inaccurately, this is basically what they do. No, their construction works, right? But just my description of it doesn't. the observation is that, you can check whether this P sub AB, well, if you had 2t plus 2 points, you could check whether it was a degree 2t plus, a degree 2t polynomial. And it's a degree 2t polynomial if and only if the original inputs were valid encodings, were of degree t. So this is our input checker. We just represent the polynomials with one more evaluation point. And then to check the inputs, we multiply each input bit with itself. We just use the fact that the multiplication gadget decodes the coefficients, and we check whether this leading coefficient is 0. And we get leakage resilience because in a valid execution, the input is a degree t polynomial. The product is a degree 2t polynomial. The leading coefficient is 0. So whatever function you compute from it, I know what the output is going to be because I know that it's applied to 0. So it's a constant function.
I don't understand your observation. A product of two polynomials is degree 2t if and only if each of the polynomials is degree t. What if I take a degree 2t polynomial and multiply it by a constant?
No, I know. I don't mean up to degree 2t.
I don't understand.
Up to degree 2t, right? If you have two polynomials of degree at most t,
Yeah.
you multiply them together.
Sure. But the opposite is not true. If I multiply two polynomials together and I get a polynomial of degree 2t, it doesn't mean it's. What if the first polynomial is of degree 2t? That's not degree 2t.
And the
That's
other
not
one is of
the other one
degree
is a
0.
constant.
But they're the same one. You're right. So you're right. It's the same. So I know you're right. This is written wrong, and I agree. So the observation is for multiplying. So it should be that PA times A. Yeah, you're right. Yes, you're right. I'm sorry. I agree that the slides are misleading. So I don't mean in general. I mean for our purpose, this was what I meant to say. But you're right. So thanks. So it should be. Yeah, I didn't want to do PA and PA, but I should have clarified here in the observation that it's actually multiplying with itself. So then it has to be, if it's degree 2t, it has to be degree 2. Okay. So one kind of caveat about this input checker is that, so if it's not really, if these are not degree t polynomials, you multiply them, you get something that's not 0 in the leading coefficient, but it could be any field element. And I basically want it to be like 0 or 1. So I need to use Fermat's-Vittel theorem, and then the degree blows up to basically field size. So there are a few open questions here. Even if you only care about probing resilience, right, and you don't care about getting useful leakage, so one thing is getting, an input checker of lower degree, because it's just annoying to have field size. The other thing is that the input checker was for Shamil encodings. There's also construction based on AG codes, and to come up with an input checker for the AG codes-based construction is open. And this has motivation because the construction for Boolean circuits uses the AG codes. It uses the fact that with AG codes you can get T probing security with a field of constant size, whereas for Shamil you need to have the field size at least 2T. And so if you start off with AG codes, you can basically emulate the constant field size operations and get Boolean circuits. You can't do this with a Shamil-based construction. Okay, so now very, very briefly about the Miles-Viola leakage-resilient circuits, and this is where I'll end. So I wanted to add soundness to the Miles-Viola leakage-resilient circuits. What they do is they construct leakage-resilient circuits that resist the widest class, basically, that we know of, in the sense of, in this talk, this resists the widest class of leakage functions out of all the compilers we looked at. And the reason is they work over non-commutative rings, or at least this is how they get the advanced leakage resilience. So when we want to come up with a sound leakage resilient variant of the Miles-Viola construction, there are two things we should care about. So one thing we need to check is that the inputs encode bits, because again, we're working over these rings. We get ring elements as input. We need to check that these encode bits, and this is what I managed to do. What didn't I manage to do? So actually, kind of like a personal note, this is where the original failure was. So this is actually where I had the proof and everything was great, except that leakage resilience didn't work anymore. So we need a mask checker. This leakage-resilient circuits, they use structured randomness like other leakage-resilient circuits, and we need to check that the masks are valid. So, and this is the open question, to come up with a leakage-resilient variant of the mask checker, and what are the obstacles? So we do have a mask checker in this work with Yuval and Guang. We do come up with a mask checker for the Faust et al. Leakage-resilient circuits. Why doesn't it translate? So it doesn't because we kind of inherently, crucially rely on the fact that these masks are from a commutative set with a zero. Two properties that are not satisfied by non-commutative rings. And I don't know how to generalize. Okay, so let me just sum up. So my original goal was to improve zero-knowledge PCPs. Along the way, I've learned a lot about leakage-resilient circuits, and I feel like we've progressed a little bit towards getting better or more suitable leakage-resilient circuits for this application. So one thing we did was design a candidate leakage-resilient circuit based on ISW, and the open question is to prove that it actually resists the leakage class that we hoped that it does. We know that proving similar leakage resilience guarantees for GIMSS is basically going to boil down to proving this for the first bullet, so maybe not worth looking at that. We construct a sound variant of the probing resilient, leakage resilient circuits of ADF, and I showed you the kind of open questions we have there with extension to AG codes and reducing the depth of the input checker. And we have the Miles-Viola construction where we make a first step towards a sound variant by checking the inputs, but the main problem of checking the masks is still open. And as I talked briefly kind of in the middle of the talk, we also have an extension to other proof systems with non-efficient verification and zero knowledge, but here we need to, kind of the missing piece is to come up with a linear code with good distance that resists useful leakage. Okay, that's all. Thanks.
All right, I think we'll take questions offline. We'll take a coffee break, and the last talk will start at noon.